Hello and welcome once again to the third and final day of India on the Brink Summit. I'm the Executive Director of Stichting the London Story, and together with Genocide Watch, the Alliance Against Genocide, and several other diaspora-led organizations and allies, we are organizing this three-day summit to commemorate 20 years since the Gujarat genocide and make critical assessment of where India is headed as a nation. Through this summit, we engage with global experts, thought leaders, policymakers, and implementers to hear how the government of India, under the present regime, has systematically removed legal protections for minorities and allowed an atmosphere of hate and vilification to take grip on the lives of Indian Muslims. To those 200 million Muslims in India, I want to say we are watching. We are watching the Indian government, and we are in solidarity with you. Throughout this summit, experts and eminent speakers have come together to affirm our commitment to human rights and our commitment towards Indian Muslims. And we will do whatever it takes in our attempt to prevent an impending genocide. And as we come towards this penultimate panel of this summit, I'm joined by four more experts who, in their sphere of expertise, have worked with communities, victims of hate and atrocity crimes, and with policymakers in their quest for justice. So I would like to first give the floor to Arjun Sethi. Arjun is a community activist, human rights lawyer, author, and law professor based in Washington. He works closely with Muslim, Arab, South Asian, and Sikh communities and is the editor of American Hate, Survivors Speak Out, an NPR Best Book of 2018. Arjun holds faculty appointment at Georgetown University Law Center and Vanderbilt University Law School and co-chairs the American Bar Association National Committee on Homeland Security, Terrorism, and Treatment of Enemy Combatants. Welcome, Arjun. I'll invite you to start with your opening remarks, please.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much to everyone who's attending. Thank you to my co-panelists, and thanks especially to you, Ritu, for moderating and for helping organize this really important conference. My remarks will be brief. I'm going to start by talking a little bit about how to identify some of the precursors to genocide, some of the ways in which we can better track and monitor those precursors, and then speak a little bit about the role of technology in that space as well. When thinking about even just sort of the idea of this conference, India on the Brink, and sort of what ultimately leads to genocide, I think we need to be thinking about these precursors. And by some definitions, I think it's safe to say that perhaps there are episodes of genocide that have already occurred in India. But thinking about sort of the mass scale, some of the precursors that one wants to look for are things like ideology. Is there an ideology of discrimination? Are there certain groups that are being classified and dehumanized in different ways? We've obviously seen this with the Muslim community. We've seen this with the Dalit community. Is there dangerous speech that is targeting these communities? In addition to dangerous speech, are there actually acts of discrimination and hate violence targeting these communities? Are there armed groups apart from the state that are sometimes organizing and committing these acts? And then lastly, is there a civic space, right, where this discrimination, where these acts, where this targeting can actually be discussed and repudiated? And so as we think about these precursors that I've just talked about, and as has come out sort of throughout this conference, all of these things are happening in India today. Whether it's ideology, whether it's dehumanization of Muslims, whether it's dangerous speech at the local, national level, whether it's organized hate violence by organized armed groups, and again, sort of the shrinking of this civic space to actually discuss what's happening. And so in terms of where we go from here, one needs to be thinking about monitoring and accounting for the hate violence that's happening on the ground. And so that's at the local level, that's at the national level. And so in India today, for example, the government claims to track hate violence. And yet they do not, in their statistics, actually track religious-based hate crimes, nor do they track crimes committed against journalists. But as you may surmise, some of the hate violence that they do track and they do break down by category includes crimes committed by so-called left-wing extremists and anti-national hate crimes, right? So the data that we have, that we get from the Indian government specifically regarding hate violence, isn't just incomplete, but it also intentionally paints a very distorted story by virtue of what it's actually capturing. We've also seen very little accountability for those who have perpetrated hate in India. As has come out, I've attended several panels. In some cases, perpetrators have walked scot-free. In other cases, they've actually been garlanded and actually joined the Modi cabinet. And of course, we know that PM Modi himself has never explicitly even acknowledged the various ways in which Muslims and Dalits are targeted in India. In this day and age, today, hate violence against Muslims in particular is so rampant in India that in some cases it's actually organized online, organized through WhatsApp groups, and the videos are uploaded online for the world to see. In terms of ultimately who is best left to do this work, in some cases, it's actually local organizations. And so in the ideal blue sky scenario, we would have a thriving free press. And make no mistake, there are truth tellers in India. There are extraordinary journalists in India, but they work under constant fear of harm. They work under constant fear of being censored. And so again, if we had our way, we would have independent organizations, both in the nonprofit space, both in the public interest space, and with journalists who could actually document what's happening and freely report on what's happening. We would also be in a situation where actually public interest organizations and charities received funding so that they could actually put out these findings. And that's important as well, because as we've seen, even in the United States, for example, when you trust and ask government to put out data that's sometimes incriminating of themselves, they distort it, just like we've seen in India. The last point I want to make, and I know we'll touch on this later, is specifically about the role of technology. And so I've already mentioned how in so many ways technology has actually been used as a tool to perpetrate hate violence, whether it's organizing through WhatsApp, whether it's uploading these videos online. We also know, for example, that the BJP during the last national election actually had a WhatsApp group for every polling station, right? That's more than 900,000 WhatsApp groups. And so the other side is clearly using technology as a weapon for oppression, as a weapon for harm. And so I think part of what we also need to be doing is thinking about what are the ways in which we can use technology to better track hate, to better track discrimination. And just a few ideas that are worth thinking about is, one, can we use AI to actually track hate speech as it's being put out on Twitter and Facebook? Can we create crowdsourced systems where everyday people using smartphones or otherwise, when they see incidents of hate, can actually upload that material online so we have a sense of, again, who's being targeted, where, and by whom? And yeah, is there a system by which we can actually create some type of even perhaps international repository of data regarding hate and discrimination in India? Because again, we've seen time and again that a lot of folks domestically who have tried to capture this information have been shut down and have been censored. And so can we connect these crowdsourcing initiatives and possibilities with perhaps maybe an international repository of data that can better give us a portrait of what's actually happening on the ground.
Thanks a lot, Arjun, for those remarks. Indeed, and this reminds me at least two databases which have been threatened by the government of India. One is the DOTO database being maintained by the by the Jamia Millia Islamia groups, and the other database is the HT database, which was shut down by the government of India. And this was a database about about lynching episodes, mob lynching episodes, and the violence against minorities. And thank you also for raising the pertinent point about the use of technology in monitoring hate speech, because this is exactly where my second speaker, Christopher Tuckwood, comes in. So without further ado, I would like you to meet Christopher Tuckwood. Christopher is the executive director of the Sentinel Project, a Canadian nonprofit organization that assists communities threatened by mass atrocities worldwide through direct cooperation with the people in harm's way and the innovative use of technology. He's also working as a principal of HateBase, the world's largest structured repository of regionalized multilingual hate speech. He has also served as project leader for the Una Hakika project in Kenya that works to counter misinformation and reduce conflict. So Christopher, welcome. The floor is yours.
All right, thank you very much. I'd like to preface what I have to say by just highlighting the fact that I'm not in any way an expert on India or the persecution of minorities there, being Muslims or otherwise. And similarly, the general risk of genocide or other types of atrocities there. I'm not an expert on any of these things. So I'm going to sort of leave the commentary on all of those various aspects of the situation to the other people on the panel, who I'm sure know much more than me. But what I'd like to do with my time is just focus instead on some of the possible options for preventing and also mitigating violence, especially at local levels. So I think that's particularly well suited to the sorts of things that my organization has worked on, and in fact has thought in the past about trying to implement perhaps in India, especially after, for example, the 2020 Delhi riots happened and that sort of thing. So first of all, I'd really like to talk about why mitigation is important. Obviously, I think we all know here that early warning and prevention is the ideal outcome here. We don't want violence of this sort, whether it's genocide or something else, to occur. However, realistically, as history has taught us, and sort of just the realities on the ground have taught us, is that prevention is not always possible, especially if the state itself is one of the perpetrators or is at least encouraging and protecting perpetrators. So in that case, we also need to prepare for the worst case scenario. It's very important to consider what can we do to actually help people who are facing this sort of violence, if it happens, in order to navigate those dangerous situations and have a better chance of coping and surviving, whether as individuals or on a collective basis. And for us, also, the local focus is important because, even in cases of very large-scale, top-down genocides, ultimately atrocities, when they're actually put into practice, happen at the local, or we could say kind of tactical level, when people are actually rounded up, targeted, killed, etc. That kind of thing still plays out ultimately on an interpersonal sort of level at that point. So we need to consider that kind of what does bottom-up prevention and mitigation look like in those kinds of situations. And that's also critical because it's what is most feasible for civil society actors. Especially if we get to that crisis point, I don't think that any of us participating in this call are going to have the ability to intervene and, control or influence what the Indian government does, or that sort of, or even lower levels of the government, or even larger non-state actors. So we really need to focus on what can we do realistically as relatively, to be honest, powerless individuals and organizations to help people facing those kinds of dangers. And so with that in mind, something that we had discussed prior to the panel was maybe just as an illustration, I should talk a little bit about what my organization has done in Kenya. And what we're planning to do also in Kenya leading up to the election in August of this year, which is expected to be a fairly likely trigger for violence. And I should note, we don't do this work only in Kenya. We also have similar projects in places like the Democratic Republic of Congo and South Sudan as well. But Kenya is the place where we've worked the longest, and especially at these local levels that I'm mentioning. So it's a really good sort of test case, I would say. So the project there, as was mentioned in the introduction, is called Una Hakika. And this is what we call a misinformation management project. So it basically takes a crowdsourcing approach to engaging members of the public in monitoring, verifying, and then countering the spread of harmful rumors and misinformation that feed into the risk of violence. And, we did this, we first created this kind of approach in response to a series of massacres that had happened between two tribes in an area called Tana Delta back in 2012 and 2013, when we found that amongst various other factors driving sort of hostility and the risk of violence, rumors were really significant because people were hearing things about poisoned water supplies or arms shipments to rival tribes that were preparing for attacks, or, abductions or attempted poisonings of their children, and these sorts of things, all of which drove that atmosphere of fear and distrust and hatred that enabled the violence. And so we set up this system whereby members of the public can report in rumors. Then our team actually acts to investigate and verify those, and then we report back to tell people, either at a very local level, maybe even targeted to a specific village, or on a much larger scale, depending on the circumstances, to tell them what is the truth and try to de-escalate tensions that way. And then in cases where as I mentioned earlier, prevention is not possible and violence does occur, this also works as something of an early warning, or even you could call it a late warning system that helps to keep members of the public informed about what's happening. So it increases their situational awareness and then helps them to actually navigate dangerous situations with critical information that they might not be able to access otherwise, such as what are safe areas and so on. So that's something that we want to develop more, actually, is that idea of localized early warning. Of course, people, as I'm sure is well known to many of the people participating or in this event or watching this event, be it genocide or other types of atrocities, these things don't happen spontaneously. They're the result of a process. And whether it's at a very large scale or at a relatively small scale, again, they're the result of a process. And that means that there are potential warning indicators. I've been mentioning rumors, that's one. The previous speaker mentioned hate speech. That's another, and that's something that we also work on. But there are more than that. So what we really want to do is start developing these ideas, these types of indicators, and a methodology that can help us not just look at what countries maybe are at risk of mass atrocities, 1, 2, 3 years from now, but look at subnational levels. So what state, province, county, city, town, neighborhood, et cetera, is at risk of atrocities in the next month, week, or even day, and then use that more granular tactical level information to inform prevention and mitigation. So just to sort of wrap up, I think that is something that has potential value in India, both in the current, under the current circumstances, where there's a lot of, it seems like, frequent and widespread, but relatively isolated and uncoordinated incidents that target, I guess we could say relatively small numbers of people relative to the whole population as of right now. It could be valuable in this current situation, and it could also be valuable in a much sort of larger scale intensified situation down the road. So maybe the time to start putting those mechanisms in place is actually right now, and start planning for then what do mitigation measures look like? Is it possible to establish relatively safe areas that people could move to during crises? Or maybe there are other ideas that people on the ground would have that we wouldn't even think about looking at it from afar. So I'm going to leave it at that. I took a little bit more than my allotted time to cover everything, but hopefully it was worthwhile. And I'm certainly happy to hear what other people think of these ideas.
Thanks a lot, Christopher. I really like the way you described about how in Kenya you have been using decentralized sort of measures to counter the rumors which have been there. And I think there is absolutely quite a lot of potential in India, especially because it is a big country. It is also widely connected through WhatsApp and, rumor industry, as we can say, and disinformation industry in a much larger manner. And of course, there is the concentrated effort by a certain ruling party to also escalate these rumors and disinformation, especially in the times of election that we see all around. I would like to call Mohan Dutta now, and let me first introduce Mohan to my audience. Mohan is a professor of communication at Massey University and is the director of the Center for Cultural-Centered Approach to Research and Evaluation. CARE is also partnering with us for this summit. Mohan is known for his culturally centered and community-based approach for participatory strategies of radical democracy when addressing inequality in healthcare policy and otherwise. Dutta has previously worked with indigenous communities, sex workers, migrant workers, farmers, and impoverished communities. And currently, Dutta is leading a 5-country project on monitoring Islamophobia and digital hate with an agenda to counter it. So welcome, Mohan, sir.
Koto, thank you so much, Ritu. I acknowledge the ancestors of Rangitane, on whose land I stand today. I also acknowledge the struggles of Maori as the Tangata Whenua of this land, whose struggles against genocide and ongoing settler colonialism inform much of the work that we do. What I thought I will do today is offer an outline of the broad method of the culture-centered approach to social change communication and look at the role that community and voice infrastructure plays in this approach. Then offer you some snippets of findings that actually nicely elucidate what many panel speakers have earlier talked about and what Arjun once again highlighted. I will draw from the in-depth interviews and a survey with 1,056 Muslims that we completed in November and December 2021, and then outline community-led prevention strategies, particularly looking at the ways in which tracing and monitoring are intertwined with prevention. So the culture-centered approach as a method makes the simple argument that in order to create spaces for transformation, we need to think about the ways in which we can build voice infrastructures at the various intersections of the margins, particularly looking at the ways in which these voice infrastructures can be built at the classed, raced, gendered margins of processes of colonization, religious majoritarianism, and migration processes. Now, essential to this idea of voice infrastructures is this notion that social change, much of it, particularly within the neoliberal context of NGOization, thought of as being driven by top-down systems, usually does not work because it doesn't have community voices as the driving forces for the change processes. So the idea of building this voice infrastructure then is based upon the formation of community advisory groups, which are at the heart of developing the methodology of both tracking and developing prevention interventions, with a key concept that forms the anchor of the culture-centered approach, which is the concept of margins of the margins, which means that the method is always looking for traces of erasure, asking these three fundamental questions: who is not present in the space, which voices are not reflected here, and how can we invite those voices in. So it's a method in that sense that is attentive to intersectionality and looking at ways in which voice infrastructures can be continually inclusive. So the community advisory groups that form the heart of the method then shape the entire design process. And these draws upon much of the decolonizing methodology work of Kaupapa Maori. You are probably aware of the work of Linda Tuhuai Smith here from Aotearoa, New Zealand, who talks about decolonizing methodology as a way to turn power into the hands of communities to generate data, make sense of data, and to actually use the data in ways that make sense of their everyday lives. So the ethnographic element of the work is shaped by community advisory groups, and then they draw upon a variety of strategies, all the way from image making, photo voice, digital storytelling, to actually capture and reflect the everyday experiences of hate and violence, to designing interviews, surveys, making sense of that data, and then actually looking at ways in which that can shape interactions with stakeholders and community-driven advocacy processes. Now I want to turn to the work that we have been doing in India. This is work that has been carried out since 2018. I want to share a couple of snippets from the in-depth interview aspect of the work. And in these snippets, what you can see is the tremendous sense of fear that is articulated by Muslims, including the fear of being killed, and how that is tied to Facebook and messages that appear on Facebook. What you also see here is that this fear then translates into not having a pathway, if you will, in the governance structure, in the police, or even in organizations such as Facebook, to mitigate and to address the source of hate and violence. So this theme that we have reported the content to Facebook and nothing has been done is a consistent theme that we see in this work. I also want to point out the similarity that we see between the work that we have done in India and the work we have been carrying out here in Aotearoa with Muslims post the Christchurch terrorist attack. And it's really powerful to look at the similarities of the themes, because what you see consistently is this idea that we have been raising this again and again, and the police haven't been responding, state agencies haven't been responding. We have been raising this to the platforms and nothing really happens. Leave aside taking down an entire page, even a post is typically not taken down, saying it doesn't violate community standards. How then does this translate into quantified experiences of hate? So I will present some of the snippets of the survey data. So what you can see here is 39% of the Muslim participants in our survey in November and December say that they have been called offensive names as a result of being a Muslim. 40% of them say that they have been targeted on social media platforms as a result of being a Muslim. We have about 64% of them say that they have come across content that encourages conflict, hatred, and violence on these platforms. 64% of them, and this is, a lot of you that are tracking India are familiar with the Corona Jihad or COVID Jihad narrative. So 64% of the sample say that they have come across content that blames Muslims for the conflict. Love Jihad is another narrative, Muslims targeting Hindu women for marriage. About 59% of the sample say that they have come across content covering the Love Jihad conspiracy theory. Now, this is really vital because much of the research suggests that dehumanization is a critical component in the hate infrastructure. And part of the dehumanization process is comparison of the targeted community to animals, or using depictions of animal-like images and language to reflect the community. And 55% of the participants say that they have come across content that compares Muslims to pigs and dogs. 56% of the participants say that Muslim immigrants will take over India. That is the kind of content they have come across. And then, coming down to the direct threat of violence against Muslims, they say that about 60% of them say that they have come across content that incites violence against Muslims. So how does then all of this exposure to content shape the experiences of security among Muslims and the sense of fear reflected by Muslims? So I'm just presenting one regression analysis that looks at exposure to hate on digital platforms and the ways in which that predicts perceptions of insecurity. And what you see here is that beyond the demographic variables, 30.4% of the variance in perception of security or insecurity is shaped by exposure to digital hate. So that's quite a substantive amount of insecurity on digital platforms. So then the question we ask, and I want to wrap up with this, is what does actually community-led prevention look like from this framework? And the first aspect of this is in terms of building infrastructures of information, media, and digital literacy that are community-led and culturally centered, where communities actually take ownership of the literacy processes and structures, and those pedagogies are not shaped top-down, handed over by us as experts, but really emergent through community networks. The second element in terms of building community education on methods of gathering data and sense making. So a lot of the work we do is in building community capacities for methods. And then coming to the preventive component is building community capacities for image making, photo voice, storytelling, building the capacities of communities to lead dialogues across differences and organizing against hate. And finally, coming down to this notion of creating infrastructures for safeguarding and solidarity. So at the heart of the work that we have been doing is this notion that communities can drive these change processes. And we have to turn to really listening to community voices to seeing what kinds of solutions can be created, but also actually to the processes of gathering data and making sense of the data. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Professor Mohan. This was very insightful, and also just to see the quantification also in terms of how the communities perceive this hate and how that drives their social security is very, it's very scary in some ways that this is the data that we have, and still companies like Facebook are unable to act or don't have enough technology to act somehow. With this, I would like to come to Nicole Withersheim. Nicole is a senior policy advisor with Center for the Prevention of Genocide, U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. I would like to remind our audience that U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum placed India as the second country at risk of genocide. Recently, Nicole has previously worked as Senior Human Rights Advisor and USAID's focal point for atrocity prevention in the Center of Excellence on Democracy, Human Rights and Governance, and as NSC Director for the Sudan and Central Africa. She has over 20 years of experience managing political transition, atrocity prevention, human rights, and complex political crisis response programs of USAID, Oxfam, and International Rescue Committee in Haiti, Cote d'Ivoire, Mali, Darfur, South Sudan, and with technical assignments in Bangladesh, Cambodia, Bosnia, and other locations. So welcome to this
Thank
panel.
you so much. Please note that India wasn't included in that. So like some of the other panelists, I want to definitely say from the outset that I'm not an expert on India. We are, because as Ritamber mentioned in the beginning, which I was going to go through in my presentation, very concerned about India. It's ranking #2 in the world in our annual risk assessment that we produce every year based on metadata available publicly for being at risk of a new event of a mass killing. So we are very concerned. We're trying to become smarter. on the context. And so I'm learning from all the speakers and all the work that you're doing here today. So happy to be here. My presentation is going to go over some of the stuff that's already been mentioned. So that's good, because we're all getting on the same page of how to work these problems out locally, how to look at early warning signs, risk factors, and triggers. I'm going to go through the frame with of how those that work on atrocity prevention in general work on this problem, and also put some links in the chat when I'm done, because I can't do it at the same time. And so bear with me if I don't get the technical side while I'm looking at two different screens, but thank you for having us here today. I am Nicole Witch. I'm Senior Policy Advisor with the Holocaust Museum on the Center to Prevent Genocide. We're going to talk about what is prevention and why do it. I'll go quickly through that because I think that's clear to everybody, and to discuss how we frame risk factors, warning signs, and triggers. Also some tools for upstream or early prevention, and then also a frame that we're developing now, we hope to produce publicly, on tactics and strategies towards atrocity response. We do note that there has already been a lot of group targeted violence in India. So we might find ourselves in that place in certain parts of the country. And then also in other parts of the country, being still able to work locally to do upstream and early warning prevention. And I note that this slide presentation is also based on some deep work that we've done in developing a course but that my colleague, Catherine Southwick, has contributed greatly. So she will recognize some of these slides, and she's with us here today. Okay, understanding prevention. I just want you to be aware, and I'll put links to this quickly in the chat when I'm done. There are these two frameworks that are used in the atrocity prevention world. And I think it's worth you all looking at them to see what could be applied just to help organize the problem, how people talk about it, and what is some indicators to track. So there's the UN Atrocity Prevention Framework. It's a very thick and comprehensive document, but it's really helpful. And then there's the US Government Atrocity Prevention Framework, which we at the museum use, and we apply to an early warning country every year. And I will have a link to that one. It says it's draft. It's because it's getting updated, and it should be released publicly by the Biden administration soon. It's coming out of the CSO division in state. But these two frameworks are helpful places to start when you think about trying to do a very careful and comprehensive assessment on the risk of atrocities in a state, in a community, or in a country, right? As I heard Arjun and actually all the panelists talk about, I would just really emphasize from our research, we know that early prevention is done, ideal prevention, is done early and local. You maximize the impact, you spend a significant amount of less money, and you maximize and preserve the local autonomy over the ownership of the problem and addressing it. You build resiliency so the community can respond to tensions that they're trying to address in the future. And ultimately, the goal is you will save more lives if you act early and act local. We have this frame. This isn't something that we've developed, but it's something that is used in the atrocity prevention world that looks at risk factors, which maybe exist everywhere. Certainly they exist in the United States. They're common, and I'll go through some of those. So that in this diagram, it just helps for people to visualize this. That is the wood, or that is what is around. And then when you combine that with warning signs, things where tensions are increasing, these risk factors are being more defined in nature, they're being consolidated, they're rising in tensions and gravity. This is the gasoline in this graphic. And then you add that with the triggering event, which is the match. And triggering events have been in other cases of genocide and mass atrocities, a significant change in the certain environment. So a political leader is assassinated, or there is a huge humanitarian catastrophe or a natural disaster like an earthquake or something that changes the balance of power, that threatens or exacerbates pre-existing tensions and the warning signs. The fire here is the actual mass atrocity or genocide. So we break these down, and ideally you're working on being cognizant and knowledgeable of common risk factors. A lot of countries that we work on already have armed conflict. You have prior discrimination and and unpunished violence of particular groups, which I know is existent in India. It's existing in a lot of countries we watch. And then some rare or risk factors are authoritarianism, economic stressors, and limited government capacity, and deep-seated hatreds that seem to run in a community or country narrative. These are samples of warning signs: tension and polarization among groups. We've talked about this, I've seen this myself as I'm learning about what's going on in India. Public rhetoric by leaders is very divisive, very like, oh my God, the world is ending, like very dramatic. You have people that have a platform labeling civilian groups as enemies. Maybe weapons are getting stockpiled. You have emergency or discriminatory legislation, which I think we're seeing in India on the books, and the lack of punishment for past crimes. People haven't learned. They might not haven't healed from past crimes, but they also haven't learned how to deal with this going forward. So they're not exploring history in order to inform the future. And then triggering events, as I said, assassinations, coups, a significant change in the dynamic that affects a large amount of people, and it dramatically heightens in a quick fashion the tensions that are existing. So we've mentioned, some of you mentioned this. I was going to say this here, and I'll put the link to the chat of our early warning. And basically just want you to understand that when you look at it, and on our website, what it does is it looks back at countries that actually had a genocide or a mass atrocity, and it looks at what their indicators were 2 years before they had an event, and it applies it to current countries to see if countries are matching those indicators. It's not predicting that there is going to be a genocide in India or Pakistan, which is number one. It's saying the environment is plausible, and the environment matches where other countries were when they did indeed have a historical event of a mass atrocity or killing. I have seen in my work in a lot of countries that have had mass atrocities, these type of things, so supporting local early warning systems. This can be as simple as actually training people to have a phone tree and talk about what's happening and connect to someone in a capital city who's organizing that information and getting it to leaders, international organizations and national entities that can respond. Hotspot mapping. This is when you go out to a community and you talk about the tensions, and I think it was June that was talking about making civil space to talk about these issues. And then actor mapping, identifying who could be the key leaders, who could be participants in violence, who would be attacked, what is their vulnerability, who could be moderators who haven't stepped up. A lot of people think of this, and we do when we look at the lessons from the Holocaust, as bystanders, but a new term that's been out there is upstanders. Who are people who maybe could disrupt this behavior, who are kind of sitting quietly and thinking, my God, I can't believe what I'm seeing, but they're not empowered to come forward and be a positive force. And then scenario planning. No scenario ever pans out exactly as you plan, but the process of scenario planning for the worst or even other types of incidents of mass killing can help you find all of the other elements that I've said, the risk figures, the early warning signs, and the triggers, and then also the key participants or targeted groups. Resilience. These are the type of things that we have seen have helped with social cohesion. Again, some of the other panelists already mentioned some of these things. Strong civil society, independent media. And in that space, I know that we're seeing a lot of hate speech in India, and it is a common factor of other cases right now that are having average citizens mobilized to commit violence on each other. And what you see is you see a loud minority occupying the airspace, right? And you just see space shrinking for moderate voices. And so you're not going to, one thing that we do know from our hate speech project, which is also on our website, is that you're not going to change the most ideologically cemented hate speech persons that are putting that information out there. You're not going to change their minds. What you need to focus on is the middle ground, the moderate, and creating that space for more people to step up and seek and also participate in moderate messaging and then ultimately peace messaging. This is a frame that we use, and this was Catherine's. I'm so glad she's here today. But she put this into a way in which you would visualize if you had a risk factor, in a given situation? What would be the opposite of that risk factor? And then you'd fill in here, what are the actions I'm going to take to get to that opposite phase? This is how you can take all this information, not be overwhelmed by the problem, grit it out, and talk about deliberative actions and strategies to oppose and push back on that risk factor, to lessen the tension, to lessen those risk factors rising to early warning signs and ultimately triggers. Some tools for prevention. I already talked about the early warning analysis, but engaging in community outreach and dialogue, identifying dangerous and hateful speech and exposing it, explaining it, support to restorative justice and truth telling, again, learning from history and giving space to acknowledge past grievances and crimes. This is one thing that we did a lot of when I was within USAID, is doing joint community projects where you bring communities that have tension together over a project that they both might benefit from. That's not addressing the direct tensions, but it's addressing the need for a new market to be built, or water sources to be built, or something that they will both benefit from. It sounds kind of simplistic, but I've definitely seen it work in lots of areas where USAID has worked, for example. And this one, I think, really applies to where we are right now in India in many cases. And this is something, again, that we are drafting and trying to release publicly soon in our Lessons Learned project. And this is strategies for atrocity response. Killing and atrocities are already underway in a given context. There are 4 areas that we have studied that we are centering around that strategies to fall under to stop the atrocities. One is that you dissuade potential perpetrators from committing the atrocities. What this means is you look carefully, why are they committing the violence? It's serving some goal to them. How do you dissuade them from using that tactic in pursuing what they want? Do they want political power, but they can't access it in the current frame, so they're using violence? Do they want financial gain? Do they want territory? What are the ways in which they think violence on a mass scale against civilians is going to fulfill their goals, and break that down and start to dissuade them? Sometimes it's blaming and shaming and exposing of their crimes, but often it's understanding their root drivers of why they're using violence as a tactic. And then you degrade their ability. So this is actual disruption of weapons, money flows, leaders' ability to use public airwaves and the internet, and other ways in which they can mobilize. So you actually hone in on their ability to commit atrocities point by point. And this can be international sanctions, or it can be local freezing of bank accounts, or international freezing of bank accounts. It depends on actual perpetrator and what your understanding of the capacity for them to commit violence. Protecting vulnerable civilian populations. We see this in many forms. Obviously, those that work in the international space, I see, UN peacekeeping forces, protection forces, but also sometimes protecting vulnerable populations means making sure that they have access to real-time information, protecting their right and their access to free speech, to free media, to basic services. It can be humanitarian assistance. It could be right to move, that they can seek safe shelter and move out of an area, that they have safe physical passage on roadways. And then lastly, if atrocities are underway, this is actually very controversial, but can be done in different ways. People should not shy away from discussing facilitating a political transition. If the leader that is in power is the one committing the atrocities, there needs to be a discussion of, if they will not budge from the first 3 strategies, how else can we get them out of the position that is allowing them to commit this? And that could be mediation. It could be pursuing elections, constitutional reform. Of course, military and regime change is very further down the pike in the world. It's not heading in that direction of that being a favorable option. But that ultimately, when the Rwandan genocide happened, or the genocide in Cambodia, those also were clear means that stopped the genocide there. So anyway, there are various strategies and tactics, and we hope to have this Lessons Learned project out very soon that unpacks a lot of this and actually supports, through research and evidence, what has truly worked to both prevent but also respond to atrocities in real time. And I'll put all my, conclusion, every case is different. Well, I think that's obvious, but that's why you have to back up and look specifically at the local level. What are the underlying tensions? What are the risk factors? How do people talk about scenarios for more violence and vulnerable groups among them in their community? The earlier, the better. It's cheaper, it saves more lives, and it should be local, as already discussed. And there's lots of information to learn. I hope you can check out our website where we both have the early warning list and some tools on hate speech, as well as how we've approached other cases to understand the frame by which those that work on atrocity prevention thematically look at countries. Thanks. And I'll put my links into the chat.
Thanks a lot, Nicole. And this is a very interesting presentation that you made also about, how the local communities can be mobilized, as well as how the international communities can be mobilized for sanctions towards certain perpetrators. And I would like to open this floor for discussion now. I would like to start with just throwing out a question on that. What is this purpose and this role of mobilizing the community? If the speakers can perhaps come in again and underscore that once more for our audience, that why is it so necessary, and what all we can achieve out of it. So any of you can, Mohan, perhaps, I see you are smiling.
I mean, the thing that we consistently see in our work is that communities are the spaces for amazing creativity, imagination, storytelling, and those stories, narratives can be really powerful in building alternative registers, if you will, that challenge the hate and that are able to mobilize against it. So that kind of solution building has to be embedded in the kinds of knowledge systems that exist within communities. So within the context of India, one of the most powerful things that we have seen again and again is countering this narrative infrastructure of hate is our narratives of syncretism, our narratives of working together and working alongside. And how do you foreground those stories and work through them, I think, is the question.
Thanks a lot, Mohan. Perhaps Arjun and Christopher can also weigh in on this community engagement, because you guys have also done a lot of community engagement in different places as well. So.
Sure. Thanks so much for the question. So just reiterating, the point that Mohan made, community and local grassroots organizations are almost always the engine for change. And secondly, in the case of India, so much of the violence that people are experiencing happens interpersonally, but also happens at the hands of the government, whether it's rhetoric, whether it is discriminatory legislation, whether it's the impunity that courts grant perpetrators. And so with that, the role of community, the role of local organizations becomes especially important because the mechanisms for trust have been so frayed.
Thanks a lot, Arjun. And it also kind of speaks to this whole idea of democracy itself, right? When the government is being irresponsible, that how we as a community can hold it responsible. Christopher, I would like to come to you onto this, and also from your experience from Kenya, that how well did it fit? And also perhaps to think of in terms of, the deeply rooted ethnic violence. And I also see that there is somebody who has put that question, that how do you deal with ingrained prejudices amongst folks? And I'm not sure whether that was a situation that you have encountered in Kenya, but if that is the case, then how is one to evolve from that?
Yeah, that's a big question, especially relative to the amount of time that we have remaining. But I think what's important to keep in mind is that these things require a long-term approach when we're talking about dealing with very ingrained prejudices and that sort of thing. However, with that being said, what we can do, at least in the type of work that we've been doing, is in the shorter term, try to reduce the likelihood of certain triggers, sort of causing those ingrained prejudices to turn into something like physical violence. So we like to also take a complementary approach with other organizations, maybe that do that more sort of long-term peace building approach, where they, try to break down those barriers and build relationships between rival communities and that sort of thing, while we focus more on kind of that day-to-day trying to restraining, we can say, of potential triggers, such as in the case of rumors that we've dealt with. Of course, there still is that issue of trust, whether it's between the population and ourselves, or between different segments of the population. And that also is something that really only comes with time. Fortunately, what we've found in a lot of the situations where we've worked is that going in as obvious outsiders actually has worked out to be something of an advantage in certain cases, because it lends a certain degree of neutrality to what we do. Of course, that doesn't mean that we're immune to sort of perceptions of bias or what have you, but it can certainly help, and especially when we're going into information-starved environments where people, regardless of their feelings towards other communities, typically do recognize that they don't necessarily have great access to accurate, neutral, verified information. That also gives us kind of an advantage as well, because we're not just going in and telling people sort of, to get along for the sake of getting along, but we're actually meeting a need that exists there that happens to also be linked to the risk of atrocities. So I don't know if that necessarily that response made sense in relation to the question, but that's kind of how I would best sum it up.
Thanks a lot, Christopher. No, it definitely does. And just because I'm mindful of the time, I do want to move to Nicole for one of the questions that I also have in my mind. And I'm going to try to reframe some of the questions which are over here and put it to Nicole, because you have worked with USAID for quite a long time. And you also spoke about that how certain sanctions can, sometimes help dissuade perpetrators to, or rather, cut their weapons by putting them sanctions. But when you look at countries like India, which is also the largest democracy in the world, right, also a politically relevant partner in the global complex, how do you see this unfolding there? Do you see, realistically speaking, chances of any sanctions coming India's way? And maybe it's a difficult question for all of us to think about.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very difficult question. I think this is my own personal opinion. I think the U.S. is taking note who voted which way on the current Ukraine crisis. So, and India's chosen a direction there that it doesn't match the United States. So I think that's an opening, a small opening. I think. It's what we're finding as we unrolled our annual risk list is there is a lot of interest and concern on Capitol Hill about India. It is all those things, all those beautiful and noble things you just mentioned, and everybody that we've spoken to sees India as a historical ally of the United States, a huge Indian American community, and so we say that. Not shying away from atrocity risk in India, but actually looking at a way in which this country stays to be all those things, right? And that this is an investment in a partnership. The United States has been humbled over the last couple of years with our own lack of dealing with history and minority persecution, minority community persecution and justice and things like this. So, this administration in particular has noted that the way to talk about these issues overseas is to start first from our domestic position and struggle and challenges and prioritization of dealing with these problems. And I would hope that could be a tactic by which we don't alienate partners in India and in particularly also the government, but that we work together with this. I also, again, in my personal capacity and maybe wearing my former USAID hat on, is that there was not a huge budget for democracy, human rights, and governance work in USAID's plan for many, many years for India. And so I think that needs to be reviewed and the way in which you help local communities do this is with flexible funding. You give them some assistance and let them figure out how to solve these problems. We would just say, with India being number 2, that the US government needs to be doing a thorough, comprehensive atrocity risk assessment on India. Now, if they do it right, many parts of that probably won't see the light of day, but it needs to inform the full whole of government, US government approach to India and all of its policies and resources and relationships with the government, whether it be development, defense, or diplomatic. And so we see it as a conversation starter. We see it as good governance and frankly, working on these issues as an insurance policy that you invest in India to avoid genocide and build peace. So that's where we'd want to see things get started, but I think it's very difficult. And I think it's how we frame this conversation. And so while we might be today here very much concerned about the killing that's already happening, the targeting that's already happening, the discrimination, and the warning signs that really do make you wonder where things are going, perhaps framing it as a way in which local civil society needs to be supported to address these problems locally, with or without the government. They need to be given the flexibility and assistance and free access to independent media and platforms in order to work on these problems. Maybe there's a different way that we frame it, but those are my comments on the problem.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Nicole. We were actually indeed during the process of formulating the final request after the summit, we're thinking about that we have to also talk about not just the madman in Moscow, but the madman in Indian Parliament right now. And with this, I would like to end this session. However, I would request the participants to stay with us, and perhaps even if the panelists would like to, they can stay with us, because we would like to play 2 videos. One of them is by Shamshad Pathan, who was in India during the 2002 riots, and he has been an advocate for minority rights and activist based in Gujarat. And he has been fighting legal battles for the victims of 2002 Gujarat riots. And after that, we want to also play a video we received in the context of Delhi violence that happened 2 years ago. And this video is from Voices of Peace. It is a grassroots media advocacy campaign. And the video is brought to us together with Hindus for Human Rights in partnership with Paigam, and Voices of Peace showcases the voices, concerns, the dreams and joys, and sometimes the terror of ordinary Indian citizens who have gone through this brutal violence 2 years ago. So I would like my admin team to first play to us the video messaging of Shamshad Pathan and then the video from the Delhi. Thank you.
जिंदाबाद साथियों, आज जिस तरह से हम जिस टॉपिक पर बात करने जा रहे हैं वो टॉपिक है जो गुजरात में एक जनसंहार हुआ था, उसको 20 साल होने जा रहा है। और इन 20 सालों में गुजरात के वो दंगा पीड़ित ने क्या देखा, क्या सहा, उस टॉपिक पर। लेकिन मैं शुरुआत करना चाहूँगा कि दंगा क्यों हुआ, क्या वजह थी और क्या सब कुछ उस वक्त हो रहा था। तो मुझे याद है जहाँ तक कि अर्थक्वेक 2001 में आया था गुजरात में, उसने एक ऐसी मिसाल गुजरात की पेश की कि जहाँ पर जब लोगों को खून की ज़रूरत पड़ी तो न किसी ने हिंदू देखा न किसी ने मुसलमान देखा। कई मुसलमान लड़कों ने अपने एक हाथ में ब्लड की सिरिंज लगाए हुए थे तो दूसरे हाथ से उस ब्लड का बॉटल को पकड़ा हुआ था। एंड उसके बाद गुजरात में 2 विधानसभाओं के बाय इलेक्शन हुए। उस इलेक्शन में जिस तरह से भाजपा की दोनों सीटों पर बहुत बुरी तरह से हार हुई, वो ये दिखा रहा था कि गुजरात में भाजपा जो है वो बहुत कमज़ोर होती जा रही है। और उसके बाद तुरंत तत्कालीन मुख्यमंत्री केशुभाई पटेल को वहाँ से हटाया गया मुख्यमंत्री के तौर पर और नरेंद्र मोदी को कुर्सी पर लाकर बिठाया गया। और उसके बाद बहुत कुछ बदला नहीं था, लेकिन अचानक 27 फरवरी 2002 को गोधरा का ट्रेन का एक हादसा बनता है। और जहाँ पर जो मेरे पास जानकारी और इन्फॉर्मेशन है कि मोदी जी जब गोधरा रेलवे स्टेशन पर जाते हैं तो उनके खिलाफ वहाँ पर नारेबाजी होती है और बिना किसी जांच के, बिना किसी सबूत के वो इस पूरे गोधरा ट्रेन के हादसे को पाकिस्तान से जोड़ते हुए ये कहते हैं कि हर क्रिया की प्रतिक्रिया होगी। और उसके बाद जिस तरह से सरकारी मशीनरी का दुरुपयोग उनके समय पर हुआ, और जब गोधरा से उन कार सेवकों की शवों को लाने की बात थी तो उनको लाने के लिए किसी सरकारी अधिकारी को उसका जिम्मा नहीं दिया गया। वहाँ से जो सब थे 54 सब 54 सब, वो विश्व हिंदू परिषद के एक नेता जयदीप पटेल को दिए, जो हाल में नरोड़ा गांव केस में अपराधी के तौर पर ट्रायल फेस कर रहे हैं। और उन 54 लाशों को उन 54 शवों को जब लाकर अहमदाबाद में उसकी परेड कराई गई और उसको पूरे अहमदाबाद में घुमाया गया, और उसके बाद पूरे गुजरात में एक उसने एक विकराल रूप लिया और एक बड़ा नरसंहार गुजरात में हम सब ने देखा। बहुत सारे लोग बेघर हो गए, कई सारे लोगों को जिंदा जला दिया गया, कई लोगों को तलवारों से काट दिया गया, कई लोगों को गोलियों से छलनी कर दिया गया। अलग अलग जगहों पर अलग अलग हत्याकांडों को अंजाम दिया गया। लेकिन इन सब चीज़ों में कॉमन था कि सरकार की भूमिका, सरकार एक मूक प्रेक्षक बनकर उसने खुली छूट दे, दंगाइयों को खुली छूट दे कर रखी थी। लेकिन इतना सब होने के बावजूद भी सरकार उसको रोक नहीं रही थी। और जब दंगा पीड़ितों को उनके घरों को छोड़कर राहत कैंपों में, शिविरों में शरण लेनी पड़ी, तो सरकार अपनी जिम्मेदारी अदा करने की बजाय सामाजिक संस्थाओं के बूते कंधों पर वो जवाबदारी आई, और सामाजिक संस्थाओं ने राहत कैंप और शिविरों के अंदर उन लोगों को शरण दी, उनके खाने पीने का और उनके रहने का इंतज़ाम किया। लेकिन इस बीच जब ये सब कुछ हो रहा था तो ये था कि न्याय का सवाल कहीं पीछे ना छूट जाए, और जिन लोगों ने ये किया है उनको सजा हो। तो जो भूमिका पुलिस प्रशासन की होनी चाहिए थी, वो भूमिका निभाने में पुलिस प्रशासन पूरी तरह से निष्फल था। और वो शायद उसकी वो इच्छा शक्ति ही नहीं थी कि वो किसी को गिरफ्तार करना या किसी को पकड़ना या उन केसों की सही से जांच करना चाहता था, क्योंकि सरकार का संरक्षण सीधे तौर पर उन दंगाइयों को, उन अपराधियों को था। उसके बाद ये सभी ने देखा कि किस तरह से गुजरात में जो आधी अधूरी एफआईआरें दर्ज हुई, उन तमाम केसों की कोई जांच नहीं हुई और उन केसों को ऐसे ही अलग अलग समरी के नाम पर बंद कर दिया गया, जिसे बाद में सुप्रीम कोर्ट ने 2000 केसेस को रीओपन करने का आदेश दिया। और उन केसेस में कुछ केसेस में सजाएं हुई, कुछ केसेस में समाधान हो गए, कुछ केसेस में अगेन पुलिस ने ढंग से इन्वेस्टिगेशन नहीं किया, एविडेंस नहीं इकट्ठा किया, और बहुत सारे केसेस में एक्विटल आ गया। और इन सब के बीच कुछ केसेस ऐसे थे कि जहां पर बहुत भयंकर नरसंहार हुआ था, और वैसे 9 केसेस में इंक्लूडिंग गोधरा ट्रेन कार्नेज का जो हादसा हुआ था, उसके साथ 9 केसों को सुप्रीम कोर्ट अपॉइंटेड एसआईटी ने सुप्रीम कोर्ट ने एसआईटी का गठन किया, जिसमें राघवन साहब की लीडरशिप में शायद दंगा पीड़ितों को, संस्थाओं को, काम करने वाले लोगों को ये उम्मीद बंधी थी कि एसआईटी जो बनी है और सुप्रीम कोर्ट मॉनिटर एसआईटी है, तो ये शायद सही से काम करेगी। लेकिन हमने उनके भी काम करने का तरीका देखा, कई सारी खामियां देखी, और उन सब के बावजूद अंत में जब हम न्यायालय से उम्मीद करते हैं कि न्यायालय जो इनकी खामियां हैं जो उस पर इनको फटकार लगाएगा, लेकिन वहाँ के भी एक्सपीरियंसेस हमको चाहिए उस तरह से सुकून बख्श नहीं थे। तो और भी बहुत सारी बातें करनी हैं, शायद आगे करेंगे, लेकिन इसके साथ एक सवाल ये था कि जो दंगा पीड़ित हैं उनके पुनर्वसन का सवाल, जिसके ऊपर राज्य सरकार बिल्कुल चुप रही। कुछ संस्थाओं ने कॉलोनीज़ बनाई, शायद गुजरात में 86 कॉलोनीज़ है, कुछ कॉलोनीज़ में बहुत अच्छी सुविधाएं हैं, कुछ कॉलोनीज़ के टाइटल्स दंगा पीड़ित लोगों को दे दिए गए हैं, लेकिन आज भी बहुत सारी कॉलोनीज़ हैं कि जहां पर बेसिक एमिनिटीज़ के नाम पे काफ़ी कुछ नहीं है, सरकार वहां पर कोई ध्यान नहीं दे रही है, और जो दंगा पीड़ित कॉलोनीज़ हैं और दंगा पीड़ित लोग हैं उनको आज तक उन मकानों के टाइटल्स भी नहीं मिले हैं। तो ये सारे सवाल हैं, और इसके साथ जस्टिस को लेके बड़े सवाल हैं कि क्या 2002 में जो जनसंहार हुआ था उन केसेस में जस्टिस हुआ है। मैं मानता हूं कि गोधरा के केसेस को छोड़ दिया जाए तो 8 केसेस में 7 केसेस में ट्रायल कोर्ट के फैसले आ गए हैं, लेकिन आज भी एक केस है नरोड़ा गांव का, जिसमें 20 साल के बाद भी ट्रायल कोर्ट का फैसला नहीं आया है, और कई सारे पीड़ित एक इंसाफ की उम्मीद में उन्होंने अपनी अंतिम आखिरी सांसें ले ली हैं, उनका इंतकाल हो चुका है। बहुत सारे पीड़ित हताश हो गए हैं कि क्या हमको कभी जस्टिस मिलेगा या नहीं मिलेगा। हालांकि मैं ये मानता हूं कि आगे के जो केसों में फैसले आए हैं वो भी जस्टिस नहीं है, क्योंकि वहाँ पर भी जस्टिस के नाम पर सिर्फ धोखा ही मिला है लोगों को। लेकिन फिर भी ये एक लड़ाई है जिसे लड़ा जा रहा है। आगे हम लोग और बात करेंगे। खुदा हाफिज़।
You are speaking on mute, Ritumra.
Sorry, I didn't realize that I was on mute. Because keeping in mind the time, I would in some ways like to end this panel, but at the same time, I also want to utilize the space that we have created with a couple of attendees joining in, almost 41 attendees joining in, and those listening in to also see the videos that we received from India as the aftermath of the Delhi violence. So please, can you play that? Thank you.
किन जमीनों पर उड़ाओगे इमदाद का कहर, कौन सा शहर उजाड़ोगे बसाने के लिए। मैंने अपने हाथों से बुझाई हुई है दहकती हुई आग, अपने बच्चों के खिलौने बचाने के लिए। अपने बच्चों के खिलौने बचाने के लिए।
यहाँ से आप लोग कितने लोग लगभग कूदे थे?
ऐसे थे हम 11 जने। जब आग जो लगाई इन लोगों ने ऊपर जो पहुंचे गेट तोड़ने के लिए, फिर हम बराबर में अपनी आंटी जी से कहा, आंटी जी हमें बचा लो। 10 बजे करीब उन्होंने चौक पे से आग लगानी शुरू करी। चौक पे से लगाने के बाद फिर हमारे बराबर में लगाई आग, हमारे गेट के घर में, फिर हमारे घर में लगाई आग। तो सभी कुछ हो गया, घर में जो था सब गया। नुकसान तो कुछ ऐसी चीज बची नहीं, जो कुछ बच्चों को खरीद के दिला दे, जो कुछ करा है सब कुछ मोल का खरीद के लेके आए हैं, रिश्तेदारों ने दिलाया है, सब कुछ करा है। ऐसे कोई चीज नहीं आप भी देख सको घर में क्या कुछ बचा है। नुकसान तो सभी कुछ है। अंदर हमारे लकड़ी का फर्नीचर बना हुआ था पूरे कमरे में, और उसी में सब लोग सामान था। अंदर जमीन के कागजात भी थे, गाड़ी के कागजात भी थे, और तुम्हारे की घर मकान सब बच्चों की चीज जेवर सब उसी में रहता था। हमारा कैश भी उसी में रखा रहता था अंदर कमरे में,
जवाहरात
उसी में था सब कुछ। हम तो ये भी नहीं उठा पाए कि तो अपना कैश ही लेके भाग छूटते, कैश भी नहीं लिया, कैश भी नहीं ले पाए हम तो कैश भी उठा लेते।
3 बच्चों की शादी करते, बच्चों की 3 बच्चों की बेटी और बेटे शादी करते, सब कुछ नमक करती है।
पूरी रात मचाया हुआ।
अच्छा।
और उसके बाद में हम पूरी रात जगे रहे, हमारे बच्चे भी जगे रहे, क्योंकि मोमदन लोगों की दुकान उन्होंने छाट तो उन लोगों ने फूंक डाली, सब जला डाली। और उसके बाद में जिसके दुकान में हिंदू लोगों का दुकान में मोमदनों का सामान था हिंदू लोगों की में, उन्होंने क्या नाम है सामान बाहर निकलवा के करवा दिया उन्होंने कि हमारी दुकान मत तोड़ो।
अच्छा।
उसके बाद में कोई बात नहीं, दिन निकल गया, सुबह हो गई। अब 2 घंटे के लिए वो दिया था उन्होंने गैस, मतलब 7 बजे से 8 बजे तक का। उसके बाद में हम कहने लगे इनसे तुम ऐसा करो, हम बच्चों को लेकर चल रहे हैं यहाँ से, क्या पता हमारा तो डर लग रहा है, क्या पता दिन में कुछ होने लगे। बोले ऐसा बात है, दिन में कुछ नहीं होगा, होगा तो रात को होगा जो होगा, अब देख लेंगे। नहीं ऐसी कोई बात नहीं, लोगों में आपस में चेड़ थी वो हो गई, घरों में कोई किसी के में कुछ नहीं होगा, कोई बात नहीं। हम सीधे से ऐसे रहे अपने घरों में जैसे रहते आए हैं। उसके बाद में भैया ऐसे बजे थे 9 बजे थे, 9 बजे के बाद में फिर उन लोगों ने जय श्री राम शुरू नारे कर दिए लगाने हैं रोड पे। अब लगने लगे, हो गए 11 बज गए, 10 बजे करीब उन्होंने चौक पे से आग लगानी शुरू करी। चौक पे से लगाने के बाद में फिर हमारे बराबर में लगाई आग, हमारे गेट के घर में, फिर हमारे घर में लगाई आग। वो नीचे लगाई, गाड़ी खड़ी थी, हमारी बड़ी गाड़ी खड़ी थी, एक बाइक खड़ी थी, एक अंदर छोटी बाइक खड़ी थी, साइकिल थी, अंदर हमारा नीचे सामान था बहुत, उसमें लगा डाली उन्होंने। गेट तोड़ के ये वाला गेट तोड़ा सामने का, फिर उसके बाद में साइड का तोड़ के गाड़ी निकाल के बाहर बढ़ी, उसमें आग लगा दी थी। और हम यहीं पे बैठे थे, मतलब यहीं पे थे हम सब, यहीं पे बैठे रहे कि यहाँ ऊपर नहीं आएंगे, शायद नीचे करके चले जाएंगे, कुछ ऐसा हमें कोई पता ना था ऊपर भी आ जाएंगे। हमने कुछ भी नहीं, जैसे बैठे थे इसी तरीके से दुआ करते रहे, बस बैठे रहे। उसके बाद में फिर वो तोड़ के सामने वाला गेट ऊपर आने लगे, फिर हम उल्टे सीधे भैया छोड़ कर ऊपर भागे, ऊपर चले गए, सबसे ऊपर छत पे ऊपर के गेट लगा दिया हमने। उसके बाद में उन लोगों ने तोड़ा फोड़ी बहुत करी, बहुत तोड़ा फोड़ी करी। उस 2 घंटे करीब रहते वो हमारे घर में, लूटा काटी करके जो अपने सामान था वो ले गए या फेंका कुछ, वो हमें पता नहीं, हम ऊपर ही छुपे बैठे थे। जब आग जो लगाई उन लोगों ने ऊपर जो पहुंचे गेट तोड़ने के लिए, फिर हम बराबर में अपनी आंटी जी से कहा आंटी जी हमें बचा लो, तो उन्होंने कहा कोई बात नहीं बेटे आ जाओ करके उन्होंने हमें बचा लिया, अपने घर में छुपा लिया। सुबह दिन के 11 बजे से उन्होंने रात के 12 बजे तक छुपा के रखा।
वो कौन थे?
पंडित जी थे हमारे पड़ोसी, उन लोगों ने हमें बचाया।
उन्होंने कितने बजे से कितने बजे तक अपने घर में रखा?
उन्होंने रखा था 11 बजे से रात के 12 बजे तक घर में। हमने कहा था हमें कैसी भी करके कोशिश करके निकालो तुम यहाँ से। उन्होंने क्या काम करा, पुलिस फोर्स बुलाकर उनके भैये ने उन्होंने हमें रात के 12 बजे निकाला था। रात के 12 बजे मंडी तक पहुंचा दिया। बोले अब आप, हमारे रिश्तेदार आ गए थे मंडी में, वो हमें ले गए। तो जैसे भागे
जान बच गई, माल भाग में हम जान बच गई भैया हमारे बच्चों की। हमें भी जला के खाक कर देते, मार देते हमें सबको। तेरे रहने थे, हम सब तेरे रहने थे, जो बैठे हमारे बच्चे तेरे में बैठे।
तो आप लोग बगल में कूद करके भागे?
हाँ, पंडित जी ने बचाया, पंडित जी इधर हुए, पूरा रोटी दाल भी खिलाई, चाय भी पिलाई बेचारों ने, जो बात है उन्होंने बचा। फिर रात की 12 बजे बाद इन्होंने निकाला फोर्स के साथ, पुलिस फोर्स के साथ बाहर मंडी तक छोड़ा। उन्होंने बचा में उन्होंने निकाला, गाड़ी पे ढका, फिर चले गए।
हमने जैसे भी उन्होंने बताया ठीक करा, उन्होंने बहुत बढ़िया बचाया, उन्होंने बहुत सेफ रखा। मगर उन्होंने ये है कि उनका नाम नहीं आना चाहिए किसी के सामने। उन्होंने कह दिया हमारा नाम नहीं आना चाहिए। अच्छा। मगर उनकी मदद होना, कुछ हो जानी चाहिए। अच्छा। हाँ,
उनको लोग कुछ आस पड़ोस के लोग बोल रहे हैं?
हाँ जी, बोला था, उन लोगों ने धमकी दी थी उनको। अच्छा। कह दिया आप बहुत गद्दार निकले, तुमने मुल्ला बचा लिया। अच्छा। उन्होंने से ये कहा कि बहुत गद्दार निकली आप, पंडितान क्या नाम है, तुमने मुल्ला बचा लिया। अच्छा। ये कहा था उन्होंने।
और आपको लगभग 12 घंटे तक उन लोगों ने बचा
जी जी 12 घंटे तक हम अपने घर में रखा था, उन्होंने छुपा, बाहर भी नहीं जाने दिया बेचारों ने। खाना पीना जो कुछ करना था उन पे जितनी हेल्प हो सकी अंदर ही करा कम, बाहर नहीं जाना।
ऐसे ही लोग हर जगह रहने चाहिए, आपको क्या कहना है इस पर कि
ऐसे लोग हो जाए तो फिर ये काम ही नहीं होगा। ऐसी इंसानियत हो जाए हर जगह तो ये काम नहीं होगा। इंसानियत कहाँ है इंसान के अंदर? अब हमारे गाड़ी की किस्त जाती थी, किस्त के थोड़े बहुत पैसे 8,000 रुपये की किस्त जाती थी, कोई 10-12-15,000 रुपये होते हैं, 15,000-16,000 रुपये। जो बात अब तो बोल रहा है भैया 15-16,000 रुपये बस सारी हमारे तो भाई घर में रहते सब ना, हमारे 15-16,000 थे घर में बस। गाड़ी की किस्त जाती थी, हमारे कोई चीज़ गाड़ी चलाती उधर घर कर दे, खाक कर दी तला कुछ ना बचा घर में। ये दंगा करा रहे हैं, पता नहीं कौन करा रहा है, कैसे कहाँ से आ रहे हैं, कुछ पता नहीं, कुछ समझ में नहीं आ रहा। यहाँ को कूदे थे नीचे को, जब वो लोग गेट तोड़ने लगे ना हमारे ऊपर का, तो हम इधर को कूदे थे नीचे। ही देखो कितनी है
यहाँ से आप लोग कितने लोग लगभग कूदे थे?
ऐसे थे हम 11 जने।
11 जने?
11 जने नीचे हमारे किराएदार थे और हम थे, एक हमारे बराबर वाले नंदोई थे मेरा। अच्छा। ये जब हम कूदे थे
तो पैर वगैरह में चोट?
जी पैर वगैरह में अब तक ठीक नहीं है बच्चों को, अब तक दर्द होता है। लड़की ने कहती है मेरे पैर ठीक नहीं है, मैंने किया तो भाई ऊपर वाले से दुआ करो ठीक होंगे, हम किसी ने करे वही ठीक करे। कह रहा था इधर क्या अम्मी बिल्ली को मार देंगे, मैंने कहा भाई नहीं मारेंगे, यहीं छोड़ दे तू, हम आ जाएंगे शाम तक। बोला नहीं बिल्ली मर जाएगी मेरी, तो उसमें रुपट्टे में करके इसकी माँ को भी बच्चों को भी धर के नीचे को कूद गया। हमें तो पता भी नहीं पड़ी किस टाइम बचाए इसने, हमें नहीं पता था बिल्कुल इसने बिल्ली बचा ली। जब नीचे बता रहा जाके दिखाए हमें तब पता पड़ी कि बताओ ये बिल्ली कैसे ले आया। कोई चीज़ लेकर नहीं, सर पर रुपट्टे तलक के ना थे हमारे उस टाइम पे, जो ही बिल्ली लेकर भागा।
जैसे कि ये नीचे डोल लेते, हमने इसे पकड़ लिया, एकदम वो गेट तोड़ने लगे, हम एकदम भाग के मैंने इसे पकड़ के नीचे को फेंक दिया।
अच्छा, इन छोटी छोटी बिल्लियों को लेकर के?
हाँ।
किस चीज में बंद करके लेके गए थे?
गोद में थे मैं।
अच्छा।
दुपट्टे में।
माँ भी इनकी है, ये भी तीनों बच्चों को धर के गोद में लेके कूद गया। तीनों बच्चों को लेके गोद में धर के और दुपट्टे में बंद करके तीनों को लेके कूद गया इधर को। सब कह रहे थे बताओ कुछ नहीं बचाया, बिल्ली के बच्चे बचा डाले, बिल्ली बचा ली। सब हंस रहे थे इस बात को, तो मैं सोच के बताओ इन्होंने बिल्ली की जान बचा डाली कि हमारी बिल्ली जल जाती, इसलिए तो बिल्ली बचा डाली।
जग बौराना साच कहो तो मारन धावे, झूठे जग पतियाना साधु देखो जग बौराना। हिंदू कहत है राम हमारा, मुसलमान रहमाना। आपस में दो लड़े मरत हैं, मर्म कोई नहीं जाना, मर्म कोई नहीं जाना। माला पहिरे टोपी पहिरे, छाप तिलक अनुमाना। बहुतक देखे पीर औलिया, पढ़े किताब कुराना। करे मुरीद कबर बतलावे, उनहु खुदा न जाना, उनहु खुदा न जाना। या विधि हंसत चलत है हमको, आप कहावे स्याना। कहे कबीरा सुनो भाई साधो, कहे कबीरा सुनो भाई साधो, इनमें कौन दीवाना, इनमें दीवाना साधु देखो जग बौराना साधु देखो जग बौराना
Thank you for that video. And I would like to end this panel on this somber note, just to say that our country, India, is under a siege of a very fascist government. And we can only hope that we can express enough solidarity across the globe to hold this government to account. I would like you all to also join us for our last panel, which is starting in 30 minutes. The last panel is on India's role in global Islamophobia, and we have once again very eminent experts over there. Thank you.